welcome everyone. I hope you're having a good Sunday or Monday for those of you in Australia and New Zealand. Tonight we're going to be talking about a complex and sometimes confusing topic on the seeker's path, namely sexuality, and what to do with our so-called animal nature in our practice of awakening. At a cultural moment when the body and spirit are often viewed as separate, opposing, conflicted powers in human life, regardless of what religion you happen to belong to, what's a seeker to do with his or her animal nature, sexuality? Where does it belong on the hierarchy of individual awakening? Is sexuality to be avoided or indulged? Is it to be condemned or celebrated? Are we meant to integrate our sexual natures into spiritual life, as some forms of devotion in the East, including the Tantric school of Hinduism, suggest? Or better to preserve a necessary distance between the two? What is the role of sexuality on the path of awakening? Is sex, as traditional religions teach, valuable only between married people or between individuals of opposite sex, but avoided or held suspect outside of the sanctity of marriage? Or is this view outdated and incriminating? Is it out of touch with reality and in need of a thorough overhaul by people in the 21st century who are interested in cultivating our so-called higher nature without abandoning or dissociating from the insistent calls of our so-called lower nature? These are some of the questions that we'll be exploring today, not in search of some definitive answer, of course, but simply to open our minds and hearts to a topic that confronts all of us sooner or later on the path to understanding ourselves. Now, although the mythology of sexuality versus spirit is as old as Western civilization itself, the psychological approach of duality can be traced back to about the early 18th century, when a French anatomist named Maynard Dupuy declared that because of our two-sided brains, human beings are homo duplex, meaning not one but two. At first sight of a human brain, he saw that there were two hemispheres, and therefore we must be two people. With the growth of brain science over the ages, this interpretation of human nature served to ratify the notion that we are, as human beings, doomed to being forever divided against ourselves. It came to be believed that these seemingly antithetical impulses inside of us can never be truly harmonized, particularly where men are concerned. Cultures around the world are nearly unanimous in their belief that women are less ruled by their sexuality than men, due to the mixed blessing of testosterone. When hormones come into play, we're told, morals among men tend to just go out the window. You may know the German saying that when the penis gets hard, the brain goes soft, or as Robin Williams liked to say, that God gave men both a penis and a brain, but not enough blood supply to run both at the same time. Today, of course, we understand that female sexuality is no less intense than male sexuality. Women just tend to prefer connection over reckless philandering, generally speaking, and will go to comparatively greater lengths to preserve relationship. This has to do with all sorts of evolutionary biological factors that are actually quite illuminating to learn about. It's a vast generalization, of course, regarding both men and women. But for the purposes of our conversation today, let's just take it as a given that women are just as lusty as men and equally torn between so-called higher and lower impulses, depending on the situation. Now, this is because both sexes have these bi-hemispheric brains that do, in fact, run different hardware for different sorts of tasks. The job of the older part of our brain, known as the reptilian or the limbic brain, is to make snap judgments about what we want and don't want, whether it's fight or flee, whether it's approach or avoid, whether it's mate or move in the opposite direction. The function of the newer, much weaker part of our brain, however, the cerebral cortex, is to reason, to take a slower, more methodical approach to our choices, to consider options, to weigh consequences, and to make what we think of as rational choices. Now, we all need both of these abilities, of course. what one physicist calls thinking fast and slow. But making these styles work in tandem, as all of us know, is no easy task. So often in life, what we want to want and what we actually want are two different things. So is what we want in the moment and what we might want for the long run. A marked feature of human psychology, in fact, is this inability to bring our motivation in line with what we know to be prudent. That's because the gut mind contradicts the head mind, which contradicts the groin mind, which leaves us all in a heap. Psychologists call this design gap between reason and emotion the enemy within. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, and then we're surprised when our bodies don't respond as if these stories were real. The oughts and the shoulds that we absorb from our culture, in fact, have very little impact on desire itself. One of my favorite psychologists, Jonathan Haidt, uses the analogy of a rider on the back of an elephant. The rational mind, this puny little rider, kicks and screams with all its might to steer this emotional and sexual elephant the way it wants to go, but mostly to no avail. Once the elephant animal impulses are engaged, the little rider's efforts are mostly useless. If you've ever tried talking yourself out of a feeling, whether it's a sexual craving or any other emotion, you know that this is true. It's next to impossible to reason yourself out of something once you're already feeling it. You may well be able to control your impulses, but you can't make that tingle of arousal go away by thinking. In fact, studies show that our reasoning abilities decline in proportion to our passion. In other words, the more intense the feeling, the more ineffectual the rational mind becomes. For example, when a group of teenagers were asked a series of questions about how they make ethical choices once they're aroused, the results were fairly shocking. When they were asked about their propensity to engage in questionable activities, such as unsafe sex, youth's predictions were off by more than double once they were in a hot, aroused state. When asked about sexual preferences and the likelihood of engaging in, quote-unquote, somewhat odd activities, their predicted desire was nearly twice as high, in fact 72% higher when aroused than cold. In other words, what people say they will do in a cold state, in an unaroused state, fails miserably in predicting the influence of desire once the body has taken over. There's a similar phenomenon that exists in the paradox between intimacy and sexual desire in relationships. Intimacy being the province of the slow, careful, rational self focused on caring for one person, and sexual desire being the product of the fast, irrational creature self. In her wonderful book, Mating in Captivity, this month's guest speaker in the Seekers Forum, Esther Perel, who's a foremost authority on human sexuality, puts this beautifully. She explains that passion in a relationship is commensurate not to spiritual values of care, trust, and openness, as we might expect and even hope, but rather to how much uncertainty and risk a partner can tolerate. As Perel writes, quote, eroticism resides in the ambiguous space between anxiety and fascination. Isn't that great? Eroticism resides in the ambiguous space between anxiety and fascination. She says, quote, what makes for good intimacy rarely makes for good sex. She says, when people become fused, sex no longer happens. Aggression, objectification, and power all exist in the shadow of desire, she writes, and are components of passion that do not necessarily nurture intimacy. And that's because, as Esther Perel tells us, desire operates along its own trajectory, unquote. This is part of what can make sex so confusing for all of us, whether or not we're involved in spiritual life. The very things that we aspire to, harmony, love, peace, this closing of the gap between ourselves and others, actually seem to conspire against our very biology. But the problem isn't the body's impulses. The problem is how narrowly we divide what is spiritual and what isn't. We tend to place all the things that are rational and controllable and emotionally light, in other words, not body-dominated, as permissible, and to put our wayward, transgressive, sometimes darker physical impulses as taboo, less than spiritual, and therefore to be pushed away or denied. But of course this repression doesn't work. In fact, it causes nothing but trouble and can wreak havoc on truthfulness and authenticity in the seeker's life. And yet we continue to labor, and I see this all the time, even in the most progressive spiritual communities, under this misconception that goodness somehow equals prudishness, and that love equals gentleness and restraint at all times. What this leads to sometimes in relationship is that we can castrate ourselves and the other person, erotically speaking, with puritanical ideas of what's loving and what's not, what's permissible and what isn't. And then we wonder why the conjugal bed goes cold. It's because we force one another into squeaky clean boxes and then ask ourselves why we feel like we're suffocating. Let me just tell you a story that illustrates this very common situation. Years ago, I was in London doing an interview at the BBC. My first book, Sex, Death, Enlightenment, had just come out. And the program host had been asking me about this very subject that we're talking about today, is how to reconcile sexuality with spiritual life. After the interview was over, I was on my way out of the station when the producer ran up to me and stopped me and asked if we could have a word in his office. One of the great things about being a memoir writer is that people feel free to tell you their stories, often in the most brazen detail. That day, I sat there with this young 30-something guy who was just visibly distressed. When we got to his office, he explained to me that he was in a kind of devastating crisis of faith and didn't know what to do about it. This young man, who was clearly earnest and intelligent, had gone to India a few years back where he'd met a teacher and began a meditation practice that he loved and kept up regularly. This practice had taught him to calm his mind, to observe his thoughts, to experience a depth of well-being inside his own skin that he had never really known before. He'd been an unhappy kid, a kind of a rebel without a cause teenager, chronically angry at the world, and when he began to meditate and discovered the spiritual life, he found himself transformed. And part of this peacefulness had come, he told me, by following his teacher's suggestion that he become celibate for a period of 6 months. After he started practicing seriously, the teacher suggested celibacy for 6 months as a way of detaching from the compulsion for sex and purifying what he called his higher intentions, focusing his energy on his inner life and kind of soothing the animal self into submission. This guy had been a major womanizer, he told me, and he was very eager now to leave all of that behind, at least for a while, to begin a new kind of life where his spirit and his heart were running the show, and chasing skirts was a thing of the past. In his case, the experiment succeeded. This guy managed to maintain his celibacy for a full 6 months, even surprising himself. And in the process learned a great deal about who he actually was. He found that when he was free of the compulsion to get women into bed, he discovered just how much of his energy had been devoted to sex, thinking about it, looking for it, making it happen. And how, with this lens temporarily removed, sublimated through his spiritual practice, he felt as if his perspective had been widened. Suddenly he was looking at the world not through objectifying, conquering eyes, but with a greater appreciation of women as people. In the same way that addicts who quit cigarettes can suddenly taste in a way they couldn't before. This guy found himself able to feel and touch and hear and sense and be with others in a more sensitive, less self-centered way and with less of an agenda. And he said it felt like his being had flowered when this happened. He said, I was more in my heart than ever before. And this openness had come as a real revelation to him. It said that the spiritual value of celibacy is that it opens us to what's called poverty of the spirit, meaning humility, a compassion for the lonely, for the unloved. That's the beauty and the value, spiritually speaking, of celibacy. It's not meant to be punitive. It's meant to open our hearts and to see beyond our own sexuality in order to let people in at a deeper level. And all of this appeared to have happened to him. And yet he didn't aspire to the life of a monk. And when the 6 months are over, he'd come back to England and his so-called normal life, hoping for romantic love, which he was vowing to take more seriously and imbue with what he had learned about self-control during his time of sexual abstinence. Well, after a few months, he began a relationship with a woman he met in his local meditation group. Feeling open and vulnerable and heart-centered as never before, he fell madly in love with this woman. He said he was just transported by her company and her body in a way that had left him feeling quite overwhelmed. At first, their love-making was tender. It was enraptured, he said. And he felt as if, in his own words, that he'd finally lost his emotional virginity. He'd never felt so loved or seen before. And for a few months, this lyrical sex life continued. Soon, however, he felt something else beginning to stir inside him. It was like a bear coming out of his cave after the winter, wanting to flex its muscles and be wild, make some noise, to not be so docile. He had this unmistakable urge to be dominant, he said, to break the fetters of caution and allow his animal self to roar. When he began to express this feeling, this freedom, in bed, however, his girlfriend had a very bad reaction. And for the first time there was a tension between them. The more he attempted to show her his sexual nature, which included ferocity as well as sweetness, the more she withdrew from him. And the more she withdrew, the more confused he became. He was caught between his desire to please her and to behave, and this primitive urge to be himself. Well, soon enough, she stopped sleeping with him altogether and threatened to break up unless he curbed his enthusiasm, so to speak, and went back to being her sweet little boy toy. This ultimatum left them at a standoff, unable to connect or to communicate in any meaningful way. And now this poor guy was just beside himself. He said, what should I do? Was his girlfriend right in her criticisms? Was it true that he'd regressed to some unevolved state and needed spiritual chastising and self-control? Was she right in accusing him of wanting to objectify her? And if so, how could he stop doing that? Or did the truth lie somewhere in the middle, between total intimacy and faceless abandon, between cautious tenderness and lusty attack? If this was so, this young guy had been thinking, how could an ordinary man with male desires hope to walk that erotic tightrope? Now, I felt a lot of sympathy for this guy, and I wish that I could give him some kind of surefire solution, as if such a solution existed. But the truth, as I had lived it, was far less certain and more mysterious than such either-or, black or white answers suggested. The bottom line, as I saw it, I told him, was that not being honest would make neither him nor his girlfriend happy in the long run. Denying half of his sexual nature would never help him feel whole or balanced. Attempting to leapfrog his shadow side with its secret desires and its naughty pleasures was not the way to be wise and whole. Nor was it any use trying to shame himself into wanting to be purer than he was. The only way out of this conflict, I suggested, was through the shadow of his own complexity. And that's because, in my experience, unless a couple is willing to allow for all of who the other is, including in matters of sexuality, no true or sustainable intimacy is possible. There's plenty of room for compromise, of course. But if being with this woman meant taming his animal nature into some kind of neutered, domesticity. And if she believed that his passion was somehow less than spiritual, it seemed to me unlikely that the relationship would endure. Well, the young man thanked me, and he added that he was now more confused than ever about what to do. But he did say that he felt less guilty. And after that, I said goodbye. I never saw him again, and I have no idea what happened. I hope that his girlfriend was able to open her mind a little bit, and that he was able to finally stop blaming himself for having been born into a lusty body. Now, the vast majority of spiritual seekers come up against this impasse sooner or later, where the body wisdom tells us one thing, while scripture or practice or philosophy tell them something different. In our drive to transcend merely physical existence and nurture our so-called spiritual selves, it's easy to become idealistic and forget that we're animals too, and that far from being a pity, this is a beautiful thing, and precisely as it should be. Because we're not meant to go beyond sexuality. Though some may choose not to be active sexually, or some may outgrow the impulse for personal reasons. We're not meant to go beyond our sexuality. We're meant to grasp the exquisite contrast between the holy and the so-called profane, and to use this contrast to deepen our own wisdom. Remember, wisdom means having the ability to hold two apparently opposite truths in your mind at the same time, to live in paradox. In this case, it's the paradox that while we are spirit having a human experience, we're also humans having a spiritual. We're spirit having a human, yet we're also humans having a spiritual experience. Okay, we're not just spirit having a human experience. In other words, we're not one or the other. And it's this very bothness, this double nature, that undergirds and enriches the human condition. As human beings, unlike any other animals on the planet, we have the prospect of spiritual awakening. Animals don't need to awaken because they were never asleep. They were never expelled from the garden. Without the sex-tinged, death-tinged, imperfect life of the flesh, the longing for God would be far less potent. If we didn't have such a strong elephant within us, overpowering us with its huge appetites, the spiritual path would be less compelling and necessary. And those moments when we do manage to bridge the different parts of ourselves would be less delicious and less meaningful. It's precisely because we are animals that the divine calls out in such a clear voice. If the body weren't bound for the grave, what need would there be for liberation? When we recognize this symbiosis, it brings maturity to our lives as seekers and an end to this puritanical form of self-punishment. It also brings gratitude for the challenge itself, the very tension between the so-called higher and lower, because it sharpens our discernment and it strengthens our spiritual muscles. We come to see that the middle way is the path of freedom, denying both extremes within us, without indulging either one. In other words, we bless our own desires without being controlled by them. And when we do feel controlled by them, we learn to maintain the ability to take a step back and ask ourselves if our behavior is leading to suffering or love, and then making adjustments accordingly. In the case of that British radio producer, for instance, the animal dominance that he wished to express was not intended to harm his girlfriend. In fact, he hoped to give her and himself even more pleasure, to widen their repertoire of lovemaking under the aegis of the deepest affection. The conflict only arose when his girlfriend refused to allow this freedom between them, labeled him as less than evolved, and then shut her heart to her boyfriend's desire. So ask yourself, what do you believe about sexuality and spirit? Do you believe that you have a body or that you are a body? Do you think that sexuality is a hindrance to enlightenment? Are you in conflict with your so-called higher and lower natures? Do you allow yourself just so much freedom, erotically speaking, but no more, for fear of losing either your spirituality or your self-control? Or do you see these different parts of your being as contrasting colors on the mandala of the human condition, and part of what it means to be a whole person? Do you believe that the shadow is permitted to play as well and to heal itself through sexuality, which is one of sexuality's most critical functions, and that would be a whole other talk? Or do you lock it away, this sexuality, this animal nature, in order to attempt to be good, and then wind up feeling bored or shut down or disconnected? Do you believe that it's even possible to be mindful when we're in the throes of passion? Or is that desire to be mindful in the throes of passion itself a way of imposing cogitation and reason on what's meant to be a wordless and conceptless experience? These are fantastic questions to ask yourself as seekers, because none of us who has a body is free of desire. And no one who has ventured into any arena in the spiritual path has not been told at one time or other that desire is a problem. And that creates a false conflict within us that makes us unhappy and then tends to prompt people to either act out or shut down. And neither of those are skillful means. Because repression, as everybody knows, turns into toxicity. You could say that the repression turns the shadow toxic. There's nothing wrong with the shadow in itself. The shadow contains our strengths, our as well as our weaknesses. It contains shame as well as the potential for joy. It's only through repression that shadow becomes toxic. And you see that when you look at people who repress their sexuality without having fully embraced celibacy. The sexuality doesn't go away. It just manifests in sometimes shameful ways, such as we see with the epidemic of sexual abuse by priests and other spiritual leaders. When we suppress the animal, it grows fangs. If we try to ignore it, it becomes a monster. That's why in Greek mythology, Eros follows his sister Chaos into the world, because the animal holds both power and madness when it acts out through the unacknowledged shadow. Okay? The animal holds both power and madness when it acts out through the unacknowledged shadow. Because the sexual impulse, the animal self, has no morality, strictly speaking. It doesn't live on that side of the brain where we create our moral systems. But that doesn't make it evil. It makes it like a riderless elephant. Okay, it makes it a power in need of steering and balance. And the trick is to develop a relationship to the animal self that's both embracing and wise, to acknowledge the body's appetites and needs while remembering that we are more than a body. That really is the master stroke, in my experience, when it comes to being a sexual person on a spiritual path. It's to ride the animal self with lightness and to allow the witness to be in the room without killing the wildness inside us.